Hello and welcome to Rule of Carnage, a series of conversations between me, Mike Hutchinson, and this guy, Glenn Ford, about designing better miniature games. We are experiencing fear and trepidation and refusal to discuss a topic which is not very close to my heart because it never seems to appear in my games, which is the psychology of our toy soldiers. We had a previous conversation about the sort of definitions of where you might put psychology in your rule system and how it might kind of manifest through the game design. But in this conversation, I think we will talk a little bit more generally about how and why and whether to include psychology effects as part of your tabletop miniature game design. Yeah. I
mean, I think you're running dry because you don't know why people should include them in your game designs because you never do. And I tell you what, I mean, I will sort of open up on my opinion about that tendency, and I think that
Please.
there's an important part, and we'll have to see what ends up spinning out from Hobgoblin at the end of the process, because I think a huge part of psychology is that it's a simulationist thing, and you know, two of the books that you've put out, Gaslands and A Billion Suns, are about machineries. It would be weird if a Star Destroyer had psychological effects put upon it. I know it's conceivable that you could have a mind control alien that takes over the minds of every single person on a given ship and makes them fly off to some illusion. But particularly given that A Billion Suns is all humans sort of level sci-fi, it would be quite odd if an entire ship of professional soldiers all suffered psychology effects. I think
here's the thing with that is that we've talked about a lot of the psychology effects, and some of them cause your units to do things, but a great number of them cause your units to not do things, or to not do things they were going to do. And at one point in the game design, A Billion Suns did very much have a disorder mechanic where the more damage you suffered, the more of these disorder tokens you got. And the disorder, one of the ways that disorder affected you was you weren't able to put the sort of additional orders on that you wanted. So, I mean, what it essentially meant was your units couldn't move as fast as they could if they weren't encumbered with disorder, or they couldn't attack as well. One of the things was it stopped you from putting orders on. Another thing was it stopped you from spending command tokens to sort of power them up. And through the game design process, I just sort of established that in a number of different directions, disorder was one sort of critical damage and effectiveness erosion mechanics. They all added up to something that was drawing fun out of the experience rather than putting it in, because it was limiting the impact and effectiveness of units on the board, so making them less interesting. It was reducing the number of decisions and options I had for every one of those units. So I think I'm very cautious about psychology mechanics because partly because I write fairly abstracted games, and partly because, as you say, I write fairly I write games that aren't on a particularly human scale insofar as the subjects are mechanical. I'm actually okay being predominantly the vehicles guy. That's a niche at least. But I think it's also because I'm really thoughtful about whether or not those psychology effects are drawing decision making out of the game, because I'm tending towards writing games with an increase in decision making. And as we were discussing on the last part of this conversation, it's perfectly reasonable to write a game where decision making is taken out of your hands to a degree in service of emergent narrative. And I suppose I feel like there is a balance to be struck there. Like the wipeout step of Gaslands is a place where temporarily control is taken out of your hands in the service of emergent narrative, but it's a very, very brief moment, and then command is given straight back to the player. And I suppose that's where I'm most thoughtful about psychology. How persistent is it? How deep is the retraction of agency from the players?
Well, I think also, in my opinion, one of the things that psychology can do very effectively is it can speed up that momentum towards the end of the game that we talked about before, the cascading effect, where once things start breaking, they're a lot easier to get off the tabletop, and once breaking starts occurring, it tends to sort of avalanche off, and you hurtle towards the end of the game once things start running. And what you have done, for example, in A Billion Suns, there are the sort of the system failures that cause you to take more wounds as you've taken more wounds. And again, it performs the similar effects of snowballing towards, okay,
Mm.
these ships are all so badly wounded that they're going to go in a minute, so we may as well just have them burst under their own auspices doing something and then get taken off the table, rather than force you to shoot a gun at them or something. And so I do think that some of the beneficial effects of psychology, you've chosen to include in the unreliable nature of mechanical devices, which is in many ways the sort of metal equivalency to psychology.
Well, and sticking on the theme of mechanical equivalence, in A Billion Suns, like one of the things that's really interesting about terror causing monsters in earlier Warhammer, or indeed models in Malifaux with auras that stop you from coming near to them, or similar, is they do this force projection, or even potentially they do this, like, movement thing. So I can land a dragon, and it forces a bunch of units away from it. It creates this space, and passive fire does a very similar job mechanically in A Billion Suns, where things are, models on the table are considering hard whether or not to enter a particular area of the board, because they know that something ghastly might happen to them if they enter there. It's not framed in psychological terms, but it ends up having a similar sort of force projection effect, or it changes the calculations of where you're going to make engagements. And so I think those elements of psychology, where an aura effect, like as you're classifying it, like a fear effect, or some kind of other psychology effect where there's a range of effect, or if something ends within charge range, then my frenzied troops have to enter. Like, I think all of those are, anything that's got an aura of effect ends up becoming a board pressure mechanic that are interesting, and I think is a good use of psychology.
They are psychology than a car and a spaceship and a magical carpet, rather than a human being in the way that a human being reacts to being scared. Cars, when they are scared, don't suddenly turn around and run in the other direction because they can't pivot on the spot. But when
Right.
cars lose control, they spin out and smash into a wall.
And sticking with the theme of spaceships, like one interesting representation of psychology I like is from X-Wing, with the stress mechanic, where having done a stressful maneuver, you get a stress, and that means you can't take an action. And it's very transitory in terms of, like, it's a little atom of the game, and you're going to do 20 activations throughout the game, so it's not a huge drain. It's not a huge impact on the game, but it asks a question of, like, okay, I've got my toy soldier, they are a character, they're a person, they have limits. How far am I prepared to push this little toy soldier to the edge of his or her, like, comfort level? And then what's the payback? What's the sort of fatigue that happens after that? Like asking them to go further than they wanted to. But I think that in that design, what I like is as I say, like, it's very constrained in its impact. It's quite simple. It then asks you a follow-up question in the subsequent turn, which is, okay, I now can't take a really risky maneuver, and has that fun moment of maybe I accidentally do and it backfires, but also, like, I now have to make a decision about whether I'm going to compromise to get rid of this psychological effect, or whether I'm going to continue to apply pressure and not get myself into a better position. So I think that's one of my favorite minor psychology things, even though it doesn't feel very psychological as a game effect.
So to the question as to, for the more traditional set of psychology effects, why to include them in the game, what the benefits are. I mean, the first one, and I think the daddy of the benefits to it, is that there is a simulationist element going on there. If you are putting troops into a terrifying battlefield situation, simulating the fact that it is terrifying makes them seem more realistic and more human. If you play a game with no psychology whatsoever that has, troopers, and particularly like not wildly well trained troopers running into a horrifying firefight, somebody always says, well, this is ridiculous, no one would do such a thing, that's bizarre, why don't we have rules to say that this guy won't run into the fire?
Do you think it makes a difference how close to reality it is? So one of the reasons that historical and modern games lean more into this is that we identify more with the reality of that situation versus playing a space opera type situation or something very sort of fantastical. It's got a cinematic irreality to it, and so we sort of don't worry about that stuff because we're dealing with heroes. And
funnily enough, I think in relation to fantasy, one of the things about fantasy is that fantasy races are by and large caricatures. And so people have more defined opinions about how the way that fantasy races should work than they maybe do about actual human beings. And I think in a funny way, if you put together a game of a modern warfare setting, and you have modern soldiers going in and acting like professionals and not getting upset by bombs going off, people go, well, yes, they're professional soldiers, and you wouldn't see a highly trained SAS officer running away from an explosion. Whereas if you put down a unit of goblins and you don't have them run away when something scary happens, or someone will go, well, that's not how goblins act. I know how goblins act. I know how goblins act even better than I know how human beings act. Goblins run away when when scary things happen.
My imagination of them is way more predictable. That's a very fair point. That's interesting.
I think caricatures are a lot more predictable than reality. So I think simulation is probably the big place that it comes in. On a more minor level, there is the inherent situation where people believe that unpredictability equals fun. Mad things happen, your troops don't do what you want them to, ho 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 ho. This absolves me of being rubbish at the game, and also gives me a story that I can tell at the end of it. Like I said, we mentioned earlier, there's the cascading effect, which is a very double-edged sword, because on the one hand it means that when the event that is meant to end the game happens, it ends the game. On the other hand, it does mean that there are balancing issues where if someone gets ahead, psychology can make them uncatchable unpleasantly quickly.
I mean, even dialing back from the canonical breaking of the line, I think like psychology can lead to chain reactions of varying lengths, and I think chain reactions, as anyone who's played Gaslands will know, like are interesting to me as a designer. I find minor cascades of things, little chain reactions of stuff intriguing, and I think psychology is a really obvious place to build in. Thing happens, so another thing happens, and that triggers something else, and that can all be for the good if that's an engine for creating more fun or emergent sort of cinematic moments.
Yeah, and I think it's important is that if you do put heavy psychology into a game, it's also important to put in buyout options. So again, referring back to Warhammer, there are immune to psychology units, because psychology can be so devastating, and through no fault of your own, on turn one something happens, you roll 2 6s, and your most expensive unit with your general in it runs off the table, and you're now boned for the rest of the game. There's a little thing in there that goes, buy this, that'll never have to happen. And if you don't buy it, it's your own fault. And if you take a unit an army that doesn't have it, then you are the sort of person who will laugh uproariously, hopefully, when the entire army runs away on turn one because a scary mouse jumped up and went kaboom, and all of your dice rolls came out terribly. So I think it is.
Although you're saying you should include them, I'm not certain there's universal love for immune to psychology.
No, but I think it's
Historically through
important.
Warhammer.
I think it's important if you put in anything where chance can have that heavy of an effect, you need to give people mitigation for it, and it can be through various ways. But do put it in, because it, it is very whenever I play any game and the dice completely ends the game, and then you look at it and you go, yeah, but there's no way I could have mitigated against that.
Mm,
What it's proven to me is that that game sometimes is a waste of time.
mm.
Sometimes, no matter what I do, no matter what I put into it, no matter how much I organized and arranged, I rolled the wrong set of dice, and so I lost. And at that point, it's just like,
There's no
play the game.
post match wash up where you're like, oh, okay, I've got something new to try next time round.
Yeah, and it's also, it's like, yeah, I chose not to pay for the thing that mitigates that, so sometimes that's going to happen to my army. And I'll accept it as a 1 in a million chance, because I could have done the thing to stop it and I chose not to. But if I can't have stopped it, then I won't accept the 1 in a million chance, and you can go stuff that game, you know, because what's the point if I couldn't mitigate against it? I want it to be my choice to not mitigate against it.
One other thing, and I'm not certain exactly how to describe this, but like there's an aesthetic choice in your game design, which is not quite simulation versus abstraction, but it's more like, do I want sort of perfect knowledge about, as a player of this game, do I want to, as a designer of this game, do I want to give the player sort of perfect knowledge of where everything can be, or am I introducing unpredictability in terms of like, well, a unit was going to move 8 inches, but it stopped because something interrupted it by being scary, or it got scooted off to the side partway through a turn. And so, you know, in some degrees, it's kind of my equivalence to my imaginings of like the board positions of an X-wing in that game. You know, that they are all discrete to a degree, ignoring bumping for a moment. There's a number of discrete places I can be on the board versus Gaslands, where, you know, it's a giant smear and I can basically be anywhere. I think psychology effects give you a way to push your game design in one way or the other, which is actually, you know, do I want this to be not discrete in the places that units and models can be, but at least very much more predictable.
Yeah, and that would be the last of my sort of big advantages in psychology, is that it's design space, it's extra design space, and it's design space that players are expecting to encounter. It's not where you go, okay, here's my game, and my game has Bibblies in it, and Bibblies let me fiddle with all the things on the tabletop and do extra design space, and it's a subsystem that slots in, and you count it out with Bibble tokens, and then you put the Bibble tokens around the table, and people are like, what the hell is this? I don't like this doesn't match into my brain. If you go, oh, there's psychology, and psychology pays out in this way, and it causes things to act in that way, and players go, oh yes, of course there's psychology, why wouldn't there be psychology? Splendid. And then you can go,
and so what, and so
okay,
Bibble in your example is like, hey, we're all just playing the Matrix and I'm the hacker, and so actually there's like laid on top, there's like information warfare, or like we're all, you know, we're all gods, and so there's a sort of like mythical god interruption thing, and it's like, well, those things are okay and maybe I can make them work, but you know what, they're just not as instantly grokkable as, you know, some of my troops are afraid, and that's why they move over here.
Yeah, if you say this game has psychology, then suddenly you can give things fear effects, you can give things panic effects, you can give them refusal effects, you can have leadership tests, you can have break tests. You have a whole layer of design space to differentiate out your different troops and different events and different scenarios. Okay, in this scenario, everything's very, very scary because you're in the jungle of Gribblies. And oh, okay, that's very different from this scenario where you're fighting on a lovely open field and no one's terrified, or this scenario where it's nighttime and anybody who comes up behind you makes you jump out of the skin.
Right, or you're the defenders of the castle, and you know what, you're never going to break because you're already in your castle. And
yeah, exactly. It gives you a massive design space in which to define things out in a very characterful and effective way, and just lets you put in extra puzzles and jolliness and chewy, crunchy things for people to play with. The problems, on the other hand, are, as I say, that the element to which cascading is a disadvantage, where it causes someone who starts winning early to be uncatchable very, very swiftly. It's extra rules. It's extra rules weight for people to engage with. It's a rule that a lot of players are expecting to be hit with, but it's a rule that kind of doesn't necessarily need to exist. Games can exist without psychology. Do you want to put in a whole nother rules section, a way of defining when psychology tests happen? Do they interrupt things? Do they? And as soon as you have things that interrupt, you're going to create fudgy situations within your game.
Yeah, and also, you know, you've got to think about the questions of the thresholds of where things happen, and you know, whether they're interrupts or not. Like, particularly if they're interrupts, like, are people going to remember the threshold and spot when it triggers and execute that bit of rules code at the right moment? Yeah.
And I think also psychology is often can be very bookkeeping intensive. You know, if a unit is suffering one or another kind of psychological effect, you've got to note that some way. And as I say, or you can turn the unit round and send it off running away. I've been people have played games where everything is all mashed into each other and a skirmishing unit is fleeing, and no one can remember if the skirmish unit is fleeing or not, or if it's just going over there because it's going towards an enemy unit. So it could be true. And so, I don't know if that's fleeing or not. And inherently, you know, certainly if you've got panic and stupidity and frenzy and fear and terror and breaking, and they all do slightly different things, and then you want to note when this thing's got frenzy on it, and it's also got stupidity on it. It's suffering from stupidity this turn because it failed its stupidity. You know, there's a lot of bookkeeping, a lot of faddling, and really,
yeah, there's a sort of school of shaken and broken, and other words meaning the same thing, like pike and shot, for example, has shaken units, and shaken units, you know, they get some negatives, and they can't do a certain thing when they win combat and stuff. And so you do have to remember which ones will mark with tokens, which ones are shaken, and then you have to remember that, like, they're currently suffering debuffs as a result of that. Which is potentially fine if you're the kind of person who's got little casualty markers to mark things, and it can all be part of the loveliness. But yeah, it's extra game state.
Yeah, noting pinning all over the tabletop in certain games ends up being its own sort of admin task at various points. So I think those are some of the basic sort of strengths and weaknesses behind the psychology system. I think the big thing, and the thing that we talked about before, and we talked about at the very top of this whole chat in the first video, is that it's a tool for a certain job, and you figure out the job you want to do. And if it's about the moment when a line breaks, if it's about simulating the nature of the horror of war, then you put in a psychology system, because without it your game won't do what it's meant to do. And if it's not about those things, maybe save yourself a lot of bother. Because I think that the last thing to sort of discuss with them a little bit is, what is the nature of the broken state of the unit? Because it varies all the way from, where you've got Warhammer, where the broken unit is running in disorder across the tabletop, and if someone charges, it's automatically destroyed, and you can take off like 1,000 points with a single flying harpy and make your opponent cry as a grown man. Through to it's disadvantaged. It has special, like it's on a -1 to hit if it gets attacked, or it, like in Saga, where once you've lost a combat, you get like fatigue tokens, and then the fatigue tokens can be spent to make you easier to hit or make it harder for you to hit them, or etc. Through to the probably most boring and most simple, which is, you fail a psychology test, you get a little off switch on you. You just get off switched for this turn. It's more or less a miss a go, or a miss a phase, or a miss or whatever.
Yeah, or the very simple, like, take a couple models off, or scratch another couple wounds, and that might eliminate the unit. Which essentially decreases your effectiveness often in games.
Yeah, and I think the thing of that is that you go all the way through from the big old Warhammer one, where the thing of it is it's a spicy enchilada, and if you get it wrong and armies break at a moment's notice, the whole game becomes an unmanageable mess. But it's very it brings the fireworks factory. When something breaks, it breaks.
I mean, thinking about that in a different scale, like, if I was writing a cowboy game, you know, that could be a really interesting mechanic for that sort of thing, where it's like, you know, if you're doing a kind of gunfight thing, like as soon as someone turns to leave, like bam, like it's over. You know, you might choose to put something in because the suddenness of that narrative guttal stop is absolutely what the story that you're trying to tell it is.
Yeah, no, I think absolutely. I think absolutely if you are designing a game that has, let's say, non-professional combatants in a non-professional, as it were, battle situation, it does kind of call upon a range of interesting, because as soon as you say, okay, it's a cowboy game, the psychology I want in a cowboy game is the staring out before drawing, and you want to hold your nerve as long, because despite probably the reality of the situation, whoever draws first definitely always dies in a cowboy shootout. It's all, you always, whoever draws first always gets outdrawn and always gets killed. So you definitely want to hold your nerve, and that's definitely a psychology test. You need to have two cowboys, and they need to test nerve and push your luck to see if you can hold your nerve longest. And then when you snap, you know, you blow the other guy's head off. And I think there's, because there was in the RPG for Seven Rings, there was a version where the samurai dueling, there was a way that you could engage in a duel where there was only ever one hit, and it was a psychological battle to see who would draw their sword first, and there was a special ability you could engage in to make the whole fight into the like the psychological battle from Hero, in, you know, the Hero movie, where it's all played out in your minds, and then one of you cuts the other one's head off and it's splendid, and then walks away. And it was a sort of whole separate set of skills. And I think there's a whole world of psychology, you know, separate from the thing that we are currently talking about, which is this sort of rather simplified thing of something happens and your troops act like idiots, you know.
Yeah, no, I mean, we're deep in battle territory here, rather than, you know, some of the other places we could be.
Yes, sure. Yes, there are a wealth of things, and like I said, I think at some point we'll have a conversation about the nature of player psychology and actual psychology in designing games. But
yeah, and I'd very much like to examine activation mechanics and orders, because I think that's the thing that we've been tiptoeing around the side of, because you know, your troops being disordered and not brave, and maybe, you know, in some way unreliable, you know, very much comes through in the activation phase of lots of games, but it is its own entire conversation for sure.
Yeah, that will definitely go onto the chat stack. Since we have now suggested a subject for a future conversation, it might well be time to wrap up this particular conversation. Hopefully we've given some food for thought on the upsides and downsides of psychology, and some of the bits and pieces that go into creating a set of psychology rules for your game. I think it's very much well worth considering. I think it's a theme specific, high risk, high reward thing to put into a game. I don't think, as Mike has proven, that it is a presumed element that all games need to have in them. But I think it's something where you need to set out your stall, understand what you're trying to achieve. And I'd say high risk, and it's just a quick comment, is that one of the things that always disappoints me is when there is a set of psychology rules and they pan out, and what happens is that somebody gets one token put on them, and that one token causes one person to hit slightly weaker than they should have been. If you're going to put a psychology system into the game, you know, make it
well, I mean, that's true of any mechanism. Like, make them count, and if they aren't having an impact, pull them out again.
Absolutely. I think that personally, I think that whether or not psychology is assumed to be part of the design depends a little bit on your vintage as a player. And I think it sort of might be a thing that's popping in and out of fashion at the moment. But
and I think it cuts very close to what is your game about. And if your game is about stuff that needs to be represented through psychology, then my goodness, you better put it in and do a good job of it. And if your game is about something else, you know, if it's about something more cinematic and or high fantasy, or there just might be reasons why it isn't part of the, it isn't needed to complete the flavor on the tongue.
Absolutely. Right. Well, we will sign off on this particular conversation then. So if you have watched this far through the chat, I assume you like some part of what we're doing here. If you do, please like and subscribe. If not, or if you have opinions about the upsides and downsides of psychology, whether it should be in a game or not, and how you like to see psychology affect troops within a game, where if you want something big and splashy or something just a little bit tweaky, please drop us a comment in the comment section. We love seeing them, love hearing them and responding to them. But for now, look us up on social media, reach out to us if you can. But we will sign off on this particular episode of Rule of Carnage. So we'll say goodbye. Bye bye.
Bye bye.